Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise.
Is he now going to do the decent thing and resign?
Is this the pose of a man who is truly sorry or a Prime Minister acting the part? Integrity, objectivity, accountability, transparency, honesty and leadership in the public interest must be honoured at all times. Has Boris Johnson lived up to the very words he penned in the ministerial code, or has he merely delayed the day his backbenchers bring him down? Tonight, with Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Leader of the House, with backbenchers and political insiders, we examine the fallout from a momentous day for British politics. Also tonight, another man on the edge. The Prince Charles sexual assault case can now go ahead, says the judge. But will the public humiliation force him to settle out of court? We'll speak to Virginia Giuffre's lawyer, David Boyce. Good evening. Boris Johnson's admission and apology may have bought him some more time, but more backbenchers are calling for him to resign tonight. And the leader of the Scottish Tories, Douglas Ross, an MSP and an MP, remains adamant that the Prime Minister's attendance at a party is a quitting matter, as do, Newsnight has been told by a senior Scottish Tory MSP, every single one of the 31 Tory MSPs in the Scottish Parliament. But Boris Johnson's fate may not lie with Conservative parliamentarians, however furious some are. It may lie with Sue Gray, the senior and apparently steely civil servant instructed by him to investigate lockdown parties at Downing Street. She is due to report on at least 7 events, perhaps as early as next week. But how can she be expected to seal the fate of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary, both of whom are her bosses? Will Boris Johnson have to weigh up those big words again? Integrity, transparency, honesty. Our political editor, Nick Watt, is here. Nick, how do things stand for Boris Johnson tonight?
Well, Kirsty, this is a dangerous period for the Prime Minister. After Prime Minister's questions, he toured the tea rooms. One eyewitness told me that there were some pretty sombre faces of Tory MPs, and they saw one MP remonstrate with the Prime Minister. Now, you mentioned those calls for Boris Johnson to go, so that means we now know that more letters are going into Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee. You need 54, and then you trigger a confidence vote in Boris Johnson. I spoke to one MP who was on his way to hand in a letter to Graham Brady, and this MP said to me, we need a bloodletting, we need a spill. I spoke to another senior Tory and they said, look, the Prime Minister's statement simply will not do the trick. And this person said that the Prime Minister usually finds a small piece of Teflon to let him slip away from trouble. But Boris Johnson has finally run out of Teflon. Now, there was a big cabinet action this afternoon to shore up support for him. But in private, there are some pretty long faces on cabinet ministers saying this is all very difficult for the Prime Minister. We need to wait to see that Sue Gray report to know exactly how strong his position is. But Boris Johnson is still standing. It is very difficult to unseat a sitting Prime Minister, and it would break with precedent to unseat a Prime Minister in the first term after securing a landslide victory in a general election. So look, this was a very dramatic day when Boris Johnson finally told us his story about the parties. A humbled Prime Minister taking his place in the bear pit of British politics. The stage for some contrition, an apology, but no admission of lockdown rule-breaking.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise. I know that millions of people across this country have made extraordinary sacrifices over the last 18 months.
Unequivocal words designed to quell unease in his cabinet after Boris Johnson attended a party in the Downing Street garden whilst telling the country that outside gatherings were unlawful. And then an admission of an error of judgment, though no admission of wrongdoing.
And I should have recognised that even if it could be said technically to fall within the guidance, there would be millions and millions of people who simply would not see it that way.
rare weakness, providing a feast for Labour.
Well, there we have it. After months of deceit and deception, the pathetic spectacle of a man who's run out of road. His defence that he didn't realise he was at a party. It is so ridiculous that it's actually offensive to the British public.
In a sign that all is not well in the Conservative Party, not a word on the Prime Minister's statement from a single Tory MP in the chamber. And the Prime Minister's leadership on the line in his own party after the leader of the Scottish Conservatives called on him to go.
Crucially for me, he said in hindsight, if he had his time again, he would have done things differently. And that to me is an acceptance from the Prime Minister that he did wrong. And therefore, to be consistent with what I've said before, I don't believe his position as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party is tenable, and he does need to resign.
This was a very different Boris Johnson standing in front of the nation today. He was chastened and steered clear of the usual jibes about Keir Starmer the lawyer as he toned down the political attacks. A sign perhaps that this Prime Minister knows he has to focus his attention on rebuilding confidence on his side. But one minister told me, Boris Johnson is finished, though not necessarily right now. One senior Tory backbencher is astonished by the affair.
Who in the name of God, irrespective of how clement the weather, would think in a month of Sundays it was a good idea to have, call it a work event, call it a knees up, call it doing a conga around the Downing Street garden, call it what the hell you will. But in common sense terms, it was a bad idea. And we talk about the rules, it was actually the law.
A long-standing ally of the Prime Minister is standing by his friend, but suggests he has work to do.
I think he's being completely honest and transparent. He's acknowledging that the event that took place at the time it took place should not have happened, and he regrets that, and he, quite rightly by the way, acknowledges that the deep pain that many people throughout the United Kingdom felt with the regulations that were in place. The challenge for the Prime Minister, which I know he will embark on with relish, is to rebuild the trust between him, the government he leads, and the British people, and get on with the agenda he has for making this country a better place for all our citizens.
But a former government advisor believes Boris Johnson is still not safe.
I don't think his apology means that he's through the danger zone. I think now the risk is that his story will unwind and that there will be proof or evidence that actually he hasn't quite told the truth. And I think that will really be the point at which relations with his political party will begin to unwind, because more than anything, the sense I get is that they really hate being lied to. They hate this level of obfuscation, and that's what gets them, and that's what's very difficult to defend to their constituents.
A dark hour for Boris Johnson, who's losing support in his party. But from friends, don't write off this great survivor quite yet.
Nick Watt, well, in a moment we'll be speaking with the Leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, but first we're joined by Fran Hall from COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, whose husband died from COVID 3 weeks after they were married, and Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary. Good evening to you both. First of all, Fran Hall, and we're very sorry for your loss. What were you thinking when you were watching Boris Johnson today at the dispatch box?
I was just, like many, many other people, offended and disgusted at the way that he chose to very carefully word the apology that he announced he was going to give. It wasn't an apology. He didn't say sorry. He basically gaslit the entire nation by saying that he thought that the event that was actually illegal at the time was a work event and not a party. We all know that's not true.
Well, of course, we wait, of course, to find out from the senior civil servant who is going to investigate that. But Boris Johnson did acknowledge the pain of millions of people when he apologised. Was that welcome to you?
If he had done it at the time, or at any point up until, I think it was on Monday, when he was smirking and laughing and not answering the question about whether he had been at this event in Downing Street on the 20th of May, then that might have had some credence. But actually today, all he was trying to do was save his own skin.
Is your ire solely reserved for Boris Johnson, or do you widen that out to other members of the government?
Every single person that sat alongside him or behind him today in the House of Commons is complicit in supporting him in telling us a lie.
Wes Streeting, turning to you now, as I just said to Fran Hall, Boris Johnson was contrite. Surely that stands for something.
I just don't believe a word that Boris Johnson said. He couldn't even bring himself to say sorry. Lying to Parliament regularly and repeatedly, as Boris Johnson has done, is in itself a breach of the ministerial code. And on that basis alone, he should resign. Given that we
let's
know,
be clear, he did apologise, Wes Streeting. He did apologise.
He didn't say, as Fran said, he couldn't bring himself to say the word sorry. He had to be dragged and humiliated to this point. This is now a Boris Johnson survival strategy in place, not a Boris Johnson doing the right thing approach. And it's not just that he's broken the ministerial code. It's not just that while lots of people were making really big, really painful, unimaginable sacrifices because they kept the rules, he was breaking them. He's undermined public trust and public confidence at a critical moment in the pandemic because we in Parliament are still asking people to wear masks, to isolate from the virus if they catch the virus, to work from home if they can, to get tested, to get vaccinated, things that impact on people's lives.
So in that case, do you have faith? But can I just ask you? Sorry, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to ask you: do you have faith in Sue Gray to return a clear, unequivocal report, whatever she comes up with, whatever she sees in the evidence?
There's no reason to impugn Sue Gray's integrity, but as you said at the outset, Kirsty, she's got an impossible task. How can a civil servant possibly hold her political masters and indeed her bosses in the civil service who seem to have broken rules to account? This is a farce. In the end, we've got Boris Johnson banged to rights. If he had a shred of decency, he should resign. And it's not just Boris Johnson, by the way. His conduct is now infecting the wider cabinet and the Conservative Party. We've had the Home Secretary, who's responsible for upholding law, who said she would report her own neighbours to the police if they had a party, defending Boris Johnson. How does she justify that to police officers who've been spat at, assaulted and abused for enforcing the rules? Or indeed my opposite number, Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, responsible for upholding health regulations in this country, defending the indefensible. People in the end will conclude that it's not just the Prime Minister who's unfit to govern, it's his cabinet. And in the end, I agree with what Jacob Rees-Mogg said in interviews earlier today, actually. It's for the voters to hold the Prime Minister to account. And in the end, it will be Conservative MPs who pay the price for this Prime Minister if they allow this to continue. And in the end, we are in the middle of a national pandemic, a big emergency, and the Prime Minister is unfit to lead. Forget the party politics. It's actually in our political interest, I'd suggest, for Boris Johnson to stay on. It is not the right thing for the country at this moment for Boris Johnson to remain in office. And if Conservative MPs conclude that he should remain in office, voters will draw their own conclusions about the judgment of their MPs.
So, Fran Hall, you await Sue Gray's verdict. And I don't know whether you concur with Wes Streeting that it's a very difficult job she has, but she's an independent person doing an independent report. Will you take what she says as face value?
I'm sure she'll do her job, but I just want to say that the Prime Minister is the highest office in the land, and we should have a leader at this time of crisis, on a day where 398 more people have died from COVID. We should have a leader of the highest moral integrity, somebody that we can all look up to, who will model the best behaviour. We haven't got that. We're being failed. And our only recourse is at the ballot box. But in the meantime, Tory MPs, you need to look at your own consciences, because the man that is leading you is a charlatan, a liar, and somebody we should never see in public office again.
Thank you both very much indeed. Jacob Rees-Mogg, if I just turn to you and put Fran Hall's original point to you, that what she did not hear was sorry.
Well, first of all, can I say to Fran Hall how sorry I am about the bereavement that she had, that is at the heart of the tragedy that has been COVID. And it is very much what the Prime Minister said this morning, that he understood why people were so angry with what had happened. Their rage, I think, was the word. But he did apologise. He opened his statement by saying, I want to apologise to the House and to the country. And so I think he has apologised. He was right to do so, because, as he said himself, with hindsight, this is not what he would have done. And he has given an apology. But I think his leadership during this period of COVID has been exceptional and has seen the country through one of the hardest times in its most recent history.
Let me quote some Tory MPs for you after Prime Minister's questions. Neil Hudson, I will not defend the indefensible. William Ragg, a series of unforced errors on matters of integrity. Now, these are deeply damaging from your own backbenches.
Well, there are many people who haven't been admirers of the Prime Minister over an extended period.
That doesn't
within
excuse
any,
it, does it?
In terms of, can you find a Tory MP who will say something disobliging about the leader of the party, you can always do that. Indeed, you used to call upon me regularly to do this about Lady May, as she now is. So I don't think finding a couple of Tory MPs, mainly who have opposed the Prime Minister. You had my very old friend Simon Hoare on. Simon Hoare has disliked Boris Johnson forever and was very disappointed with the Brexit result. So you can, of course, find people in the Tory party who will be rude about the leader of the Tory party.
And we'll come on to some
it was ever thus.
And we'll come on to more substantial criticisms in a moment. But can I just ask a very basic question? Exactly what was Boris Johnson apologising for?
Well, he was apologising for the reports that there have been of what went on the 20th of May 2020, which is being investigated by Sue Gray. He was being very careful not to preempt the investigation, but to say that, look, he's seen what it looks like, he has seen the reports, and that with hindsight, it is not what he would have done. So that's what he was apologising for.
So let's be clear. On the 20th of May last year, he spent 25 minutes outside a BYOB party with Carrie Symonds was there as well. And what he said at Westminster today was he accepts that he should have brought the people, the 30 people, back inside. But if it was a work party, there was no need to bring them back inside. They could quite happily be outside. Well, so I don't understand that.
What he has said is that he has apologised for what happened because he said quite clearly that though it may have been within the technical rules, it was not the right thing to be doing. And you posed the question at the very beginning of the programme of was this a sincere apology? I was sitting one seat away from him, and it was the apology of a man who feels very humble about what has happened, and his body language was one of the deepest sincerity, sitting from very close to where he was speaking.
It wasn't the body language of someone who thinks he's about to be toast.
No, it wasn't. It was somebody who was apologising because, as he said, with hindsight, he regretted what had happened. But I do think it's important to look at the leadership he's given during COVID, that he has managed to get the big calls right again and again to the huge benefit of the country, whether that was not locking down before Christmas, was opening up during the summer when lots of people were telling him that this was the wrong thing to do, about the vaccine programme. He has provided the country with the leadership it needed in a difficult period.
But these then, if that is the case, then these then were unforced errors or whatever that really weren't needed to be made. And he had civil servants around him who could have actually maybe provided a kind of leitmotif of how to behave or not. But I want to just go back to this idea that it was a work party. When was the last time that you took a bottle of booze to a work party?
Well, a work party?
Yeah. But this was work party, yes. Boris Johnson said.
I used to work in the city in the early 1990s when wine was regularly provided almost everything that happened. So it depends on your time perspective. But I don't think that's the point. I think the Prime Minister has apologised for what happened, said with hindsight it shouldn't have done, but that you do need to look at his overall leadership. Because if you think we've been in this pandemic for what, nearly 700 days, around 700 days, and what we are quibbling about is a very brief period, 25 minutes, and the Prime Minister has said that he regrets what happened then. An inquiry is being carried out. And bear in mind, this Prime Minister almost died during the pandemic.
Yes, exactly.
And
he almost died during the pandemic. He praised the NHS. And 5 weeks later, he's at a party thinking it was okay to be with other people in such close proximity.
He praised the NHS that saved his life.
Yeah, let me ask you, because of course YouGov have just produced a poll to say the Conservatives are 5 points down. Do you understand that some people don't necessarily think that members of the government take this seriously enough? You yourself said Conservative MPs don't need to wear masks during debates because they know each other. There is no medical reason for that.
The rules at the time were that you didn't need to wear a mask with people you met regularly.
But you also were filmed this Christmas making jokes about the allegations of Christmas parties last Christmas. Do you want to apologise for that?
No, what I was saying then was that how good it was that we didn't have restrictions at Christmas and how nice it was that we were now able to have parties legitimately. And people do sometimes wish to take the tiniest fragments and put them on social media to try and pretend people said things that they haven't.
But actually, for very many people, this is a very serious matter, not least your Scottish contingent of Conservative MSPs. Now, you have already said today that the Scottish Tory leader, who's both an MSP and an MP, Douglas Ross, you don't think he's a big figure in the Conservative Party. Tonight, we have been told that every single Scottish Tory MSP, that's 31 of them, the people that you depend on to hold up the union, think that Boris Johnson should quit. That, I would suggest to you, is a very serious matter.
Well, I would actually say that the Secretary of State for Scotland, who is a big figure, is very supportive of the Prime Minister, has made that absolutely clear. Douglas Ross has always been quite a lightweight figure, so I don't think that his...
So hang on. The leader of the Scottish Conservatives, an MSP and an MP is a lightweight figure.
I think the Scottish Secretary is a much more substantial and important figure in this.
Scottish MSPs.
You're reporting this without them actually having said this. Some of them had said, they need to say this publicly. If that's
well, we have been told by a very senior Scottish MSP.
Okay, I think though these sorts of anonymous briefings are not necessarily entirely reliable. But I want to come back to your point about how serious this is, because the Prime Minister absolutely recognised that in what he said today. And to go back to Fran Hall, nobody can hear her without feeling sympathy and the pain that people suffered. And that's why we had the restrictions that we had. Now, whether all the restrictions were the right restrictions is something that the inquiry, when it comes, will have to look into, whether it was all proportionate. But people did do their best in very difficult circumstances. And that was what the Prime Minister was saying at the dispatch box. He understood how upset people were. That's why he has apologised.
Now, today, William Ragg, who I mentioned earlier, also said that Boris Johnson could resign because it should not be down to a civil servant to decide the fate of a Prime Minister. Do you agree with that?
Well, the civil servant will not determine the fate. She will produce a report. These two things are different. But the civil servant is, of course, independent of political control. It's very relevant to bear in mind how our Constitution works, that people have said that the Prime Minister is the boss of a civil servant. He's not. The civil service are independent of political control and report to other civil servants, and it's important to understand that.
Yes. So after that, she produces a report, and it may indeed be down to Boris Johnson to look at that report and make a judgment about whether he's broken the ministerial code. And 6% of people in a Times poll think that he is actually to be believed.
I think there's a lot of agreement that it is the electorate who determines who their politicians are. The Prime Minister won a majority of 80 in December 2019. He commands confidence in the House of Commons. That is the correct constitutional position. He retains the overwhelming confidence, unanimous confidence of the Cabinet, and you've seen that today.
It took Rishi Sunak to 8:30 tonight to say that he was glad that he'd apologised, and that was all he said.
Well, he had a busy day, did the Chancellor.
So he couldn't have actually mentioned that earlier?
He was visiting somewhere in North Devon that was important for him.
Just a final question here. Should a single civil servant take the rap for this if it comes to it, if Boris Johnson doesn't have to?
What will happen in relation to Sue Gray's report is not something that we know, that we will have to wait and see what she says with evidence. It's really important to act on evidence. That's the fair and proper way to do things, and I'm sure that Sue Gray's report will reveal important facts for people to consider.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The New York judge, Lewis Kaplan, will go down in history as the man who enabled Prince Andrew, Duke of York, to be brought before a civil court. Sorry, I earlier said Prince Charles. His decision earlier today to allow Prince Andrew's accuser, Virginia Roberts Giuffre's sexual assault lawsuit to proceed means that the Prince will have to give testimony under oath ahead of a civil trial in the autumn. However, a lot is still uncertain. Whether the process will get as far as a trial, and if it does reach that point, will Prince Andrew have to appear in person? Well, I'll be discussing the case in a moment with David Boyes, Virginia Giuffre's lawyer. But first, here's our UK editor Seema Kotecha. And again, I apologise for mentioning Prince Charles rather than Prince Andrew.
It's been a waiting game for Prince Andrew, and it's not over yet. For years, he's been facing allegations from Virginia Giuffre that he sexually assaulted her when she was 17, something he's always denied.
She says she met you in 2001. She dined with you. She danced with you. You bought her drinks. You were in Tramp nightclub in London. And she went on to have sex with you in a house in Belgravia belonging to Ghislaine Maxwell.
Didn't happen.
His lawyers had argued the case should be thrown out, but today a US judge decided her civil lawsuit should be heard. Virginia Giuffre says she was trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell and then abused by Epstein. She claims she was lent out to powerful men for sex, including Prince Andrew. In 2009, she signed a settlement with Epstein in exchange for $500,000. She agreed to not pursue any claims against him. Prince Andrew's lawyers had argued the deal meant she couldn't sue him because the settlement states she would release, acquit, satisfy and forever discharge Epstein and any other person or entity who could have been included as a potential defendant. But the judge decided there was more than one interpretation of the deal, calling it ambiguous. In the ruling, he states, "The court's job at this juncture is simply to determine whether there are two or more reasonable interpretations of that document. If there are, the determination of the right or controlling interpretation must await further proceedings." He also said it was too early to consider the doubts raised by Prince Andrew against Miss Giuffre's claims, saying, "The law prohibits the court from considering, at this stage of the proceedings, the defendant's efforts to cast doubt on the truth of Miss Giuffre's allegations, even though his efforts would be permissible at trial." He said at this point, her allegations are deemed true for the purposes of this motion. Now the Duke will either have to settle with Miss Giuffre or fight the case.
From now on, what we're likely to see is more legal arguments before the trial happens. So, for example, we'll have arguments over discovery, whether each party has supplied the information that they should. We may well have arguments over jurisdiction, whether Virginia Giuffre has sufficient connection with America to rely on this piece of legislation because she now lives in Australia. And also there might well be a legal argument as to the validity of the legislation that has extended the time period to allow her to make the claim. So they're quite complex issues. They're not technicalities. They're serious issues of law that the judge will probably have to decide. And then we'll move to the trial process.
And as part of that process, lawyers say it's highly likely Newsnight's interview will be used in court.
Going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do. I have a peculiar medical condition, which is that I don't sweat. I have absolutely no memory of that photograph ever being taken.
The judge said the trial could be held between September and December. It's possible the Prince will face cross-examination on aspects of his private life, but the interviews could happen in the UK. Prince Andrew has denied all the allegations against him, but today's ruling means he's a step closer to having to give evidence in a civil case that will be a first for a senior member of the royal family.
Well, joining me now is David Boyes, who is Virginia Giuffre's lawyer. David Boyes, thank you so much for joining us this evening. First of all, How has your client been reacting to this news?
Well, she's obviously very pleased that the judge has rejected Prince Andrew's legal arguments made in the motion to dismiss. It's an important step, as you just said a few moments ago, towards moving towards trial. It is, however, just one step, and there are many more steps to be taken.
As we were saying, that civil cases do not often come to court. Is there a world in which that your client would consider a settlement, or is it very important for her to try to make sure she has her day in court?
I think it's very important to Virginia Giuffre that this matter be resolved in a way that vindicates her and vindicates the other victims. I don't think that she has a firm view at this point, nor could she, as to exactly what the resolution should be. But I think what's going to be important is that this resolution vindicates her and vindicates the claim she's made.
So she is open to the idea of a settlement?
I don't want to prejudge that. There's been no suggestion of settlement discussions at this point. Prior to the time that we brought the case, we reached out to Prince Andrew and Prince Andrew's lawyers and suggested a mediation as a possible way of avoiding litigation. There was no interest in that at that time. Whether that has changed or not, I think we'll have to wait and see.
So the idea of a financial settlement is not the thing that's of interest to her then, is it?
A purely financial settlement is not anything that I think that she's interested in.
So let's be clear about the decision today. It's actually got nothing to do with the merits of the case. And Prince Andrew has always and consistently denied the allegations. What exactly is the next step for sure?
The next step for sure is the taking of evidence. The taking of evidence from Prince Andrew, the taking of evidence from Virginia Giuffre, and the taking of evidence from other witnesses. That will begin quite promptly. We're already in the phase of exchanging documents, and that phase will continue for some time.
And is there new evidence that you wish to bring to this the possibility of a trial?
Well, there will certainly be additional evidence. Additional evidence is coming out all the time. As has been reported in the papers, people have come forward that had not come forward before to identify seeing Prince Andrew and Virginia together.
Which he has obviously always denied. To tell me, how will the Newsnight interview that was conducted by Emily Maitlis play into the next steps that you're going to take?
I'm not sure. He made a lot of statements in that interview that obviously he will have to try to back up at his deposition. But he's made a lot of those statements elsewhere in terms, as you say, his approach has been to deny, to blame Virginia, to criticize her, to attack her character, attack her morals, attack her credibility. And we'll see how all that plays out when he's under oath.
But in fact, if you were to give a percentage chance that Prince Andrew would ever appear in person in a US court, what would it be?
Well, I think there are two aspects of that. If you asked what are the chances that this case goes to trial, I think that's good. Whether he shows up himself or simply his lawyers is something that is in part up to him and in part up to the court. In a civil case, it is not always necessary that the defendant be present when the trial takes place. It's typically advisable because it's often hard to defend yourself when you're absent. But it is up first to him, and then if he declines to come, up to the judge as to whether the judge will order him to come. That's not a certainty, even if there's a trial.
David Boyce, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And for more on the landmark Newsnight interview with Prince Andrew and how it will inform what happens next, do listen to Emily's new 5 Minutes On podcast on BBC Sounds. Well, let's return to the extraordinary events in the House of Commons today and examine the Prime Minister's statements in the Chamber in detail before we're joined by our political panel. Here's our policy editor, Lewis Goodall, at the Newsnight wall.
Yes, Kirsty, today Cabinet Ministers have been taken to the airwaves and indeed the Twitter sphere to emphasise one thing. The PM apologised. Like Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, earlier today, he said this: completely understand why complete people feel let down. The PM did the right thing by apologising. But what exactly did the PM apologise for? Well, it's more complicated than those tweets might suggest. Here's a reminder of the top of the PM statement.
I want to apologise. I know the rage they feel with me and with the government I lead when they think that in Downing Street itself the rules are not being properly followed by the people who make the rules. And though I cannot anticipate the conclusions of the current inquiry, I have learned enough to know that there were things we simply did not get right. And I must take responsibility.
So, on one level, an apology, and a profound one. And yet.
And I should have recognised that even if it could be said technically to fall within the guidance, there would be millions and millions of people who simply would not see it that way.
It was missed in much of the analysis, but consider those two clips together. In a carefully worded statement, the PM actually looked both ways. Yes, he apologised for decisions made multiple times during lockdown, but he also said he believed the event to have technically been within the guidance. He did not, in fact, formally state or accept that rules were broken. At the start of his statement, at least, he was as much saying sorry for the hurt caused by the perception of wrongdoing as much as anything else. Minister said that he'd given a clear account of what happened, whereas actually he said that we should wait for Sue Gray's report. But let's examine both those key ideas of the PM's defence, that he thought it was a work event at the time and that it could technically have been within the rules. Central to this was the time he was there.
When I went into that garden just after 6 on the 20th of May 2020 to thank groups of staff before going back into my office 25 minutes later to continue working.
So 25 minutes of event. The PM was asking MPs and you to believe that he was there for that length of time and concluded that it wasn't social but a work event, that he was thanking staff simply for their hard work. Well, much will depend on the details, but bear in mind that it's been reported that during lockdown there were tables at this event, that people were eating, drinking. There were 30 plus people in attendance. He was there with his then fiancée, we're told. It was reported today that people who didn't even work in Number 10 were there. And then in terms of intention, we've all seen the email sent by the Prime Minister's principal private secretary here. After what has been an incredibly busy period, we thought it would be nice to make the most of the lovely weather and have some socially distanced drinks in the Number 10 garden this evening. And what did the rules say? Well, people were allowed, as we remember, to leave their homes for work purposes and have essential work meetings immediately socially outside with one person, socially distanced, etc. And the guidance in place at the time said that businesses should take reasonable steps to avoid people being gathered all together. One obvious way of doing this would not to have been have events in the first place. All of the events like this. We have to assume, of course, that the PM would be aware of that guidance, or should have been. So what now? Sue Gray must complete her report. Remember, there have been reports of no fewer than 7 parties or events somewhere in Downing Street during periods of restrictions. Not all of these, of course, may have happened, but some may be relatively minor, but there are a lot of accusations to get through. And politically, we hear of more MPs submitting letters to the 1922 committee chairman, Sir Graham Brady. If they get 15% of Conservative MPs, that's 54 of them, there will be a vote of confidence, a secret one. If he loses it, the Conservatives would then have to choose another leader, and Boris Johnson's days as Prime Minister would come to an end as soon as they had done so. The PM today was then trying to thread the eye of a needle. Apologise, but do so in a way which did not suggest he'd misled the House or broke the rules or the law. You can judge for yourself whether he succeeded.
Lewis Goodall will join me now to discuss some of that is Douglas Alexander, former Labour Cabinet Minister who worked with Sue Gray, Katie Bowles, the Deputy Political Editor of The Spectator, and Pippa Crerar, the Political Editor of The Daily Mirror. Good evening. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Pippa Crerar, obviously it's all over the front pages tomorrow morning, including the fact that Rishi Sunak didn't get in touch till 8:20 tonight. But do you think there are more revelations to come?
Well, a lot of people ask me that because, of course, we at the Mirror revealed quite a few of the parties which are already out there. And certainly from the conversations that I've had with people inside Number 10 and inside government in recent weeks, the gatherings that we know about aren't the only ones. And I make a distinction between sort of, those after-work drinks or a glass of wine at your desk, which could be sort of a grey area, which could be construed to be within the guidance. From those gatherings, which were quite clearly social, no work was done at them. They were in the evening. There were sort of events taking place like quizzes and secret Santas. And in the case of this particular party, tables laden with picnic food and bottles, which quite clearly seem to be in breach of the rules. But certainly lots of people I speak to, I keep getting told of other allegations that haven't been, trying to investigate them, as I'm sure many of my colleagues in the lobby are as well.
Let me turn to Katie Bowles now. You heard Nick saying earlier that more letters are going into Graham Brady. Do you get a sense of growing rather than dissipating distress in the backbenches?
Yes, I think ultimately anger is still high. I don't think that Prime Minister's questions and Boris Johnson's apology brought matters to a close. I think it's bought the Prime Minister a bit of time because ultimately a majority of Tory MPs have said they want to wait to hear what Sue Gray finds in her report and then make a judgment call based on that. But it's not getting easier for Boris Johnson. I think the fact you have a poll out tonight showing Labour have a 10-point lead over the Tories just points to trouble ahead. Even if Sue Gray's report finds a position which Boris Johnson can use to give him some space, stay in position, ward off, if ultimately MPs decide in a month or two's time that Boris Johnson is just too damaged by this, they'll make a political decision.
So, Douglas Alexander, you know Sue Gray well. I mean, she has got a task. As I said, Boris Johnson is her boss.
Yes, she's an extraordinarily accomplished and capable civil servant. She will gather the evidence, but ultimately the judgment, as Katie says, will be political. Partly because of the extraordinary reporting from Pippa and from others, the evidence is already clear. We've already established a great deal of what Boris didn't do and did do when he was in Downing Street. So the fact is this will come down to two calculations. One is, do Conservative MPs judge that Boris Johnson needs to pay the price? Or if they bottle that choice, will the British public decide the Conservative MPs need to take the choice? But ultimately, it's a political judgment, not a legal judgment, because Sue Gray's report will be comprehensive and detailed, but will deal with the facts. What happens with those facts will then be determined by the politicians.
But if what is determined by the facts is egregious,
it's already egregious. Well, what we heard in the Commons today, even from Boris Johnson's own mouth, is egregious.
Is there any way, I mean, as I say, he wrote the foreword to that ministerial code, is there any way in which he deems himself
Listen, he's a desperate man playing for time. He will say whatever it takes to get through the next few days, the next few hours. That's what we saw in the Commons today. The facts are already clear. The consequences of those facts, for the time being, remain unclear.
Now, Pippa Crerar, can I just turn to Scotland for a minute? Because I don't know if you heard Jacob Rees-Mogg earlier talking about the Scottish Tory leader as a lightweight and dismissing the idea that the 31 Tory MSPs in Scotland actually want Boris Johnson to quit. Of course, this is a Prime Minister who didn't venture north of the border in the elections in May because he was deemed to be so unpopular. Do the Scottish Tories matter at all? I mean, aren't they the ones that are holding the union together, apart from Labour, obviously, as well?
Yes, and if you look at I think the half a dozen Tory MPs, including, of course, Douglas Ross, the Scottish leader, who's still an MP as well, in the Commons. And so, of course, each of those count when it comes to putting in letters to the 1922 committee. But it's also broader than that because, of course, the Conservatives' full name is the Conservative and Unionist Party. And Jacob Rees-Mogg was very clearly not really living up or really embodying that
Interesting for an arch unionist. Interesting for an arch unionist.
rather dismissive, I think, actually. And I think that a lot of Scottish Tories will be pretty upset about that tonight. I mean, I think the last thing the Conservatives need, on top of all their current worries about their UK leader, is a internal conflict between different bits of the party within the UK. But it is notable that not just actually in Scotland, but the Northern Ireland Secretary, the Welsh Secretary, and Alistair Jack, the Scottish Secretary, were very sort of late to the party when it came to sort of ringing endorsements to the Prime Minister and coming out in support. And it's quite clear that the popular opinion as regards the Prime Minister is very different in those different parts of the UK, and England may be the stronger bit, but the other three parts of the UK, he's not so popular.
Katie Ball's just picking up on that, this idea of Conservative and Unionist Party as a calculation is also going to be made, because if this gets to be almost terminal for the idea, and of course Ruth Davidson said absolutely there should not be a separate Conservative Party, briefly, they may succeed, but they may secede.
Yeah, and I think that obviously if you have this gap where you have the leader of the Scottish Conservatives ultimately saying the Prime Minister, the Tory leader, should not be in position, you can see if that position stays, things don't improve for Boris Johnson and Boris Johnson doesn't move, it starts to look quite untenable. And you can see that in Jacob Rees-Mogg's comments. But I think what it all goes back to is how much political capital are ministers and the Prime Minister burning through right now. We've got comments, as we just touched on, about the Scottish Conservatives that can easily be weaponised, already being weaponised by the SNP and Labour, to try and suggest the Tories are not serious about the union. And then the tweets coming out from cabinet ministers, some saying Boris Johnson is the one to lead. How is that going to land with the public? And it's how long can this really go on for if this drip story keeps going?
And on that, I'm afraid we've run right out of time, but I'm sure we'll be back with more of that tomorrow night, because Katie Razzle will be here. Until then, from all of us here, a very good night.